Chapter 7 of Tractate Bava Kamma continues on the laws of property damages. The first Mishnah says, the requirement to repay something in double applies more than the requirement to pay something by an additional 4 or 5 times its value, as the requirement to pay double applies to things alive and not alive, while 4 times and 5 times payment applies specifically to oxen and sheep, depending on the animal, based on a verse. If somebody steals an animal after it was already stolen, or slaughters or sells a sheep or ox after it was stolen, he would only repay the base value of the item, not the double or 4 or 5 times excess. The Gemara says, another difference that some hold between double and 4 or 5 times payments is that double payments apply if a thief stole money and if a person falsely claims a deposit was stolen from them, while 4 or 5 times payments only apply by a thief. It additionally cites scriptural sources for the above points. It further expounds on the concept derived from these verses. There's a later case. If a man deposits an item with a person and this person informs him that he lost the item and he takes an oath that that occurred, and then witnesses testify that the borrower had just consumed the product himself, he pays just the base value of the item. If he admitted to this on his own without witnesses, he pays the base value and the fifth, plus he brings an asham offering. Further, if he had testified that the item was stolen and he takes an oath, but then witnesses come and say that he himself had stolen it, he would need to repay double. And if he admitted to it on his own without witnesses, he pays only an additional fifth, and he brings the offering. So this source essentially says that if somebody falsely claims their deposit was lost, they don't pay double. And if somebody falsely claims the deposit was stolen, they only pay double if they took an oath. It gives sources and debates over the interpretation of a few verses. These points on scriptural derivation are described at length and further argued on. It debates the particular necessity of various specific words and what concepts can be derived from them. It interprets this discussion in accordance with both opinions, which is described further. Anyways, there's a conversation as to the amount given when paying the value of an item. It said, if somebody is paying the principal base value of an item, he pays the value of the item at the time he stole it. And if somebody is repaying excess, double, or 4 or 5 times the value, it's paid in accordance with the value at the time of the trial. There are verses cited as source. It debates this further from various seemingly contradictory sources. Another source says, if monetary reimbursement is being paid precisely, it'd have the 5th addition, but if it's not paid precisely according to the principle, they would not add a 5th and would need to bring a guilt offering. It discusses verses which imply this point. It said that if an item changes during the period where it's stolen, it is technically acquired by the thief, which would mean he'd need to repay with money, not with the item. For instance, if he stole a calf and it grew up to become a bull, he'd need to give financial restitution as opposed to the actual animal. And if he slaughters it, it's technically his own animal at this point, so he would not need to pay excess here. Others strongly debate this principle. Others say that if there is an actual change in the animal, that would make him acquire it, but it's not sufficient that the animal just grew up. The animal would need to actually change its classification. Others say there is no change in classification, as even a young bull could sometimes be referred to as a bull. This is sourced from a broader debate on this topic between Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai. They essentially argue over if a physical change in an item that was stolen causes it to change ownership to the thief, although it is agreed that the excess payment goes according to the time that it was stolen. Others still debate this, and it brings various sources for this concept. Besides for the item changing, causing the thief to acquire it, it's also said that the owner giving up on the item causes the thief to acquire it, although it is debated if this is a biblical or rabbinic concept, depending on if it's comparable at all to the laws of a lost item or not. If it was rabbinically instituted, it would have been to increase the likelihood of thieves repenting. However, it is said that this principle doesn't apply to any degree. Further, it said that if the thief causes a change to the item, changing its status and designation, he would acquire it and need to repay with monetary reimbursement, such as doing something like making wood into vessels, which creates a sufficient change that he acquires it and would now need to repay monetarily, not with the actual wood that he had stolen. There was that case, which has been cited a few times, which said that if a beam is installed into a house, the thief could return only the monetary reimbursement. And instead of citing this reason that we're explaining here, that he changed the status of an item, it said that the reason was instituted to encourage repentance. So some say this is different, as in spite of its installation, it is still called a beam. Others say it's different, as it could be removed and revert to its original status of a beam. The notion that if the item is removable, its status is not changed is said to be particularly here, and does not apply by the laws of using drawn water for a mikvah, for instance, where the laws are rabbinic and more lenient. On the notion that the original owner giving up hope of recovering the item, which could possibly create an acquisition by the thief, we suggest that it possibly could work, as there's a case where a thief forces people to consecrate their items or to give tithes, so that possibly is as they gave up hope of recovering the item, but it's actually suggested to be that there the item changed status, as explained. It cites verses from scripture to support these principles. It does conclude that the owner giving up hope does not cause the thief to acquire the item, although this was possibly retracted. Back to the notion that 4 times and 5 times payments apply specifically to oxen and sheep, it further debates the verses which source this and as to why it doesn't apply to other principles. It was also said that if somebody steals a stolen object, he wouldn't pay the excess double payment. Some said this would apply only if the first and second thief had stolen it without the original owner giving up on it, as if he had, the first thief would fully acquire it, and then the second thief would be fully stealing from him and need to pay double. Others do still disagree. They debate this from a number of different logics as to whether the theft must have occurred before or after the original owner gave up on the object. Specifically, if somebody does end up selling an item he stole prior to the actual owner giving up on it, it's a debate if the thief is then responsible to pay the excess 4 or 5 times payments. Some say there would be a liability, as the verse specifies the man selling the item and paying excess without reference to the owner giving up. Others say no, as since the sale wasn't effective, as the owner hadn't given up, he's not held responsible to pay excess. They argue from further explanations. This goes further, and there's a similar dispute if this excess liability applies if the item was sold after the owner gave up. Either he would be liable, as this opinion says excess is paid no matter if the owner gave up or not, or he would be exempt, as he'd hold the owner gave up, so he gains a degree of ownership and therefore doesn't need to pay excess. It debates this from a case where a thief stole an animal, then consecrated it, and then slaughtered it. He paid double, but no 4 or 5 times payment, which is seemingly after the owner gave up, but others interpret this case to be that the owner did not give up and the owner, not the thief, was the one that consecrated the animal even though the thief had stolen it. This is in accordance with the opinion that such a consecration is permissible, as others do disagree. Additionally, the thief would need to pay the double payment here, as this was judged necessary before the consecration when it was still in his actual ownership. Then he would not need to pay the 4 or 5 times payments, as he then slaughtered the animal after the court told him to return it, thus making him have the status of a robber, one who acts brazenly as opposed to a thief who acts sneakily, and is somebody who needs to make 4 or 5 times payments. However, if the court had only told him that he's obligated to return it, not a direct ruling, and he slaughtered it, he'd still be classified as a thief and would make the 4 or 5 times payment. Anyways, in the original case, as mentioned, some say neither the thief or owner are even permitted to consecrate the animal, and that's debated from additional conversations. It's discussed further on if such consecration is permitted based on various laws of tithes. It argues as to who holds these opinions. It's stated based on the principle that such a consecration, when the owner gave up on the item, would not be allowed by either party, that a person is not allowed to write a document of authorization to have somebody else collect the debt for him. Others say this refers to the writing of a document of authorization for collecting movable property that the debtor denied owning. Further, they stated that such a document of authorization that does not have the words permitting the man to go and take legal action against the man, to take possession of the owed item and collect it for yourself, the document is not valid, as the agent here with the document does not have full authorization. If the man gave his collector authorization over half or a third of the item, it's sufficient, as he therefore can dictate policy on all of it, as he owns a portion of it. If the collector has full authorization and grabbed the item, the court lets him keep it due to his full authorization. Others say the owner and collectors are partners in ownership, and there's a practical difference if he can let the man take half the item, which a partner can, but an agent cannot. It's ruled that the collector here is legally deemed to be an agent. New Mishnah. If a man steals an animal, as 2 witnesses testify, and they or a different pair of witnesses testify that he then slaughtered the animal, he must pay a 4 or 5 times payment. Such a payment would also be necessary if he sold the animal on Shabbos, Yom Kippur, or for idol worship. If the man stole his father's animal and then slaughtered it, and then the father passed, meaning he inherits from him, or if he stole an animal, slaughtered it, and then consecrated it, he would still need to pay the 4 or 5 times payments. Additionally, if he stole the animal and slaughtered it for medicinal reasons, or to feed his dogs, or the animal has a blemish that would cause it to die within 12 months, or he slaughtered a non-sacred animal in the temple courtyard, in all these instances, the 4 or 5 times payments would still be necessary. Others say he's exempt from this payment in the last 2 cases. The Gemara additionally quotes the author of these statements in accordance with their opinions. There is a discussion, broadly, if somebody is seen having possession of a field for 3 years, it creates a presumptive state of ownership by that individual towards the field. However, if 2 witnesses see him eating the produce from the first year, and then separate witnesses see him eating produce from the second year, and then separate witnesses see him eating produce in the third year, it's debated if they combine to create a state of presumption of ownership of the field. Some say it is sufficient, others say testimony must be on a complete matter, not on separate parts. It debates the sources from additional cases. We said if a man steals an animal and sells it on Shabbos, he must pay a 4 or 5 times payment. There would be an exemption for this excess payment if the thief was also liable for the death penalty through this sale. For instance, he exchanged the animal by moving it into a private domain. There's variation on this, some clarifying that it's specifically when the animal is transferred in ownership right when it hits the ground of the opposite domain to make the case work like their opinions. There is variation on this. The reason there's liability for excess payments after selling an item on Yom Kippur is because there is still a punishment of lashes, and this opinion holds that a punishment of lashes overrides monetary punishments. It debates this from seemingly contradictory related discussions regarding punishment for violations of Shabbos. It further debates these opinions. It poses a question if somebody stole an item belonging to two partners, slaughtered it, and then admitted his theft to one of the partners, exempting himself from the excess payment. It debates if he then need to pay excess payment to the other partner. It's essentially a debate largely based on verses whether the excess 4 or 5 times payment can be paid partially, or if it must be done in full. Based on the fact that we said if a thief slaughters a non-sacred animal in the temple courtyard, he would make excess payments, this is suggested to imply that the act of slaughtering is completed at the end of the slaughtering process. This is as if slaughtering took effect starting from the beginning, the animal would immediately be made prohibited and therefore ownerless. Others disagree and say that although the slaughtering process starts from the beginning, it's only considered to be completely slaughtered after it's finished, and in this case the animal started being slaughtered outside the temple and was then completed inside the temple. There's variation on this debate. New Mishnah. If two witnesses testify that somebody had stolen a sheep or an ox, and they also testify that he had slaughtered it, but then it's found out the witnesses were lying, they receive the punishment they try to give, and will have to make the payment plus the excess 4 or 5 times sum. If it was two separate pairs of false witnesses, the pair that testified he had stolen the item makes a double payment, and the pair that testified he slaughtered it makes either a double or triple payment to equal the 4 or 5 times payment. If it was only the second pair of witnesses that were lying, the thief makes a double payment, and the false witnesses make a double or triple payment, respectively. If only one of the second witnesses was lying, the entire latter testimony is null. If one of the witnesses from the first pair was lying, then the entire testimony of everybody is null, as there isn't sufficient testimony to prove that he had stolen the animal in the first place. The Gemara says, there's a dispute if a false witness is disqualified retroactively or from the point of disqualification. Some say it's retroactive, as the false witness is at that point established to be a wicked man, and this would take effect retroactively, while others say, as is a unique case, essentially, as the witness is proven false by the testimony of other witnesses, so there's no reason to believe these later witnesses over the initial ones, besides for the fact that that's just what's ruled scripturally, so it's not a point that could be then applied retroactively. Others suggest that there would not be retroactive nullification of the witness's testimony, as that could retroactively ruin any sales made with the items from the case in the interim. There would be a practical difference with these reasons for no retroactive testimony nullification if either 4 witnesses testified on the false witness, 2 on each, or that the 2 new witnesses testify that the original witnesses were actually robbers, which is why their testimony is invalid, where the first explanation would not apply. It debates which opinion we hold like, and the opinion that the witnesses are disqualified retroactively, like the opinion of the sage Abaya, could be one of the few times we actually hold like his opinion instead of the sage Rava. It debates this from other cases, but that's the opinion we do hold like. This is discussed relating to a number of further cases. It debates the status of 2 testimonies said on both stealing the animal and then slaughtering it, with a pause in between whether the second testimony is invalidated. It debates if this would affect the prior testimony, depending on the length of time between these 2 testimonies and whether it makes it considered to be a continuous testimony or 2 separate testimonies. It debates the length and status of this interim pause time frame. It said, if witnesses falsely testify on a case of capital punishment and then other witnesses dispute their testimony, and only then they're proven to be false witnesses, they would still receive capital punishment even though their testimony was invalidated, as the contradictions of the second witnesses are deemed to be the start of the process of proving them to be false witnesses. It debates this point from other sources regarding laws of emancipation due to injury. This case is discussed further. It brings various other sources for these points. New Mishnah. If 2 witnesses testify that a man stole an ox or a sheep, and then one witness, or the thief himself, testified that he had slaughtered the animal, he pays the double payment for stealing it, and no 4 or 5 times excess for slaughtering it. If the man slaughtered and stole the animal on Shabbos, which is a capital offense, or on Yom Kippur, or slaughtered it towards an idol, or stole his father's animal, and the father then passed, or he stole it, consecrated it, and then slaughtered it, the thief pays double and no 4 or 5 times excess. Some say if it's a sacrificial animal that the man is responsible for, and he slaughters it, he pays the 4 or 5 times payment. If he's not responsible for it, he does not. The Gemara says the initial point of comparing a single witness testifying that he slaughtered an animal and himself admitting it is to show that if he admits himself that he slaughtered the animal, and then a second witness showed up to corroborate his testimony, the same principle would apply as if he had joined with a single witness, and the thief would now be responsible to make the excess 4 or 5 times payments. Others do debate this point based on discussion of emancipation through injury and the number of witnesses required to view it. It argues on the interpretation of verses as sources, and additionally on the point that if somebody admits to his own guilt, he would not be liable to give excess payments due to future witnesses. This concept is discussed further. Now, this notion would apply if the thief admitted to the principal crime of theft, which requires payment of a sum. If he admitted to something that would require payment of excess, such as that he slaughtered the animal prior to the witness's testimony, it's debated if this would exempt him from any sum. It was stated, if somebody steals an animal, consecrated it, and then slaughtered it, he is not liable to pay the excess 4 or 5 times, as he's not slaughtering the owner's animal at this point after the consecration. It now belongs to the temple. However, he would not be liable to make the payment simply by consecrating it, as this holds in spite of his consecration, it's not considered to have legally switched ownership to a second party. Some suggest the difference is if the consecrated animal was an offering that the man maintains responsibility for, so the thief in this case would still maintain a degree of ownership and he would be exempt from excess payments. Otherwise, this would not apply. This point is qualified further. It discusses this regarding various types and steps of the offering process. For instance, some would, if the blood by the animal is ready to be sprinkled, it's as if it was done. This would also apply, for instance, if the animal was ready to be redeemed, it's as if it was actually redeemed at this point. This would be seen by the red heifer, which was ready to be eaten for a period, and is therefore susceptible to impurity afterwards. So it could be made permitted for consumption through redemption. It discusses the various opinions on this topic. A source says there would be liability of the 4 or 5 times payment for stealing a hybrid sheep and goat animal. This is based on some unique wording in a verse, and it explains similar wording by other concepts. It discusses these further, and there are additional points. New Mishnah. If a thief steals an animal and sells it, but retains a small portion for himself, a hundredth, for instance, or if the case was that he stole an animal he partially owned, or he stole somebody's animal and slaughtered it, but did so improperly so it became non-kosher, or he didn't even slaughter it, he just killed it, or did other forms of improper slaughter, by all these cases the thief pays in excess of double but not the 4 or 5 times payment. The Gemara says when he sold it but retained a small portion for himself, some say it's a portion that needs to be slaughtered, others say it's the fleece that he's keeping. A different source seems to disagree with the first opinion, saying he's exempt if he retains the horn, which does not need to be slaughtered. So it must be that he holds like a different quoted contradictory source, which does line up with his opinion. Similarly, there are contradictory quotes on the point of stealing an animal during a partial ownership. Some say there's liability to pay the excess 4 or 5 times payments. Others disagree. It's explained that the difference in quoted cases is that actually both are where a thief and his partner steal somebody else's animal, and he's only liable if he then slaughtered it with the other partner's knowledge and consent, as the act has to be accomplished fully in partnership. There are several potential cases which are then posed. What if the thief reserved the rights to use the animal for 30 days before the sale? What if he stipulated in the sale that he gets to keep the animal's labor? What if he sold a pregnant animal and kept the fetus, which is qualified? And all of these go unresolved. Additionally, it's stated that if somebody steals an animal and then has somebody else slaughter or steal it, he's essentially just made the man his agent, so the thief will be responsible to pay the 4 or 5 times sum. There are other principles discussed. New Mishnah. If somebody stole an animal, but still while it's in its owner's domain, and then slaughtered or sold it outside, or vice versa, or he did both outside, he'd be liable to make the excess 4 or 5 times payment. Specifically, if he stole and then slaughtered or sold the animal, all while still inside its owner's domain, he would not be liable to pay this excess. If the thief was just leading the animal outside its owner's domain and the animal died, the thief is not liable to make any payments. If he was physically carrying it out and it died, he would be liable to pay reimbursement. If the thief told somebody else that they could take somebody else's animal as payments, such as for the redemption of a firstborn, to repay a debt, to give to an unpaid guardian, a borrower, a paid guardian, or a renter, the same laws apply. The thief is exempt if the animal dies as they're leading it out, and liable if it dies as they carry it out. The Gemara debates this principle of physical acquisition, treating responsibility essentially. Does it apply to somebody who agrees to guard an animal? Does he need to similarly physically acquire it to be responsible? Based on the Mishnah specifying a guardian must do this act of acquisition to make a thief responsible for theft, this would create the principle generally to cause responsibility for an animal. It quotes another case, if a man is seen hiding, meaning he's a thief, so he could be liable for 4 or 5 times excess payments, and he slaughters an animal, he would be liable, specifically if he struck it with a stick, for instance, causing it to move, and therefore causing this described acquisition liability. It discusses the difference between a thief and a robber, and it quotes many verses on the subject and on the negativity of being either one of these. It also quotes points on why the ox has the 5 times payment and the sheep specifically has 4 times payment, such as the ox ceases labor due to its theft, and also the sheep is less and it has to be physically carried if it's stolen. New Mishnah. Due to issues of animals grazing on crops, it was forbidden to raise smaller animals, sheep, and goats in Israel, but it was permitted in Syria and the wilderness around Israel. Additionally, raising chickens in Jerusalem was impermissible due to concerns of them dragging impure items and contaminating sacrificial meats, and similarly, Kohanim couldn't raise chickens anywhere in Israel. Additionally, raising pigs anywhere was forbidden, raising dogs was allowed so long as they were chained, and also spreading pigeon traps was only allowed if it was 8,000 cubits from a settled area. The Gemara further qualifies particular permitted regions for raising animals. There are details, such as it was allowed to keep animals 30 days before a pilgrimage holiday or 30 days before a son's wedding, and similar. Some say it is allowed to keep these animals so long as it's just not on the fields and they're just kept indoors. Additionally, it's stated that if somebody did impermissibly have these animals, he's not required to sell them all at once. He can just do it over a period. Similarly, if somebody vowed to purchase a house or marry a woman in Israel, he can do this at whatever pace he wants. It cites incidents related to this. It also says an opinion that a person can have animals that clear vermin, such as village dogs, cats, monkeys, and other animals, which it defines. Some said these particular laws of Israel also applied in Babylonia. It cites incidents on this, and it debates whether a white cat is more dangerous than a black cat. There are a number of unrelated points. It says that the alarm would ring out even on Shabbos due to a particular plague of boils. It said that a door that's locked will not be opened quickly, which is possibly a metaphor for difficulty in being ordained rabbinically, among other suggested opinions. And if somebody purchased a house in Israel, they can have a non-Jewish individual write the bill of sale on a Shabbos. Further, it's taught that Yeshua made a number of stipulations towards all the tribes living within Israel. Their animals could graze in forests, they could gather wood from each other's fields, they could take from springs, they could fish in the Sea of Galilee, an unburied corpse is buried where it's found, and many, many others, which are then explained and defined further. These are all discussed at length. It lists a number of other instituted stipulations, now from Ezra the scribe, that the Torah is additionally read from on Shabbos afternoons and on Mondays and Thursdays. Courts convene on Mondays and Thursdays. Women should comb their hair before immersing in a mikveh. Immersion should be done by men after having an emission, and many others. Again, these are additionally explained. It brings a number of other specific laws that applied solely in Jerusalem. Houses there could be bought back a year after sale. The city could never become designated as an idolatrous city. Placing garbage dumps there was impermissible. Raising chickens was forbidden. Leaving dead bodies overnight was forbidden there, and many others. Again, these are all explained further along with quoted sources. As I mentioned earlier, raising pigs in Jerusalem was forbidden due to the war between Hyrcanus and Aristobulus. Men would bribe soldiers around the siege to give them animals so that way they could keep doing the temple offerings in the temple. But once the soldiers outside swapped the animal they were giving for a pig, and when they were carrying it up, it stuck its hoof in the wall, and then the whole city shook. So pigs and also Greek wisdom were henceforth banned. Rabban Gamliel's family was the exception, being allowed to learn Greek wisdom as they were close with the government. There are further points on the issues with raising dogs and the maximum range that pigeons fly in regards to setting traps around cities. And that's the end of chapter 7.